Welcome back to Sociology of Global Social Problems. My name is Dr. Beverly Yuen Thompson. We are using a textbook for this course called Global Problems. And in this video, we're going to talk about Chapter 1, which is called Class, A World of Rich and Poor. This chapter is looking at social class inequalities around the world and bringing some historical perspective as well. So it's a huge topic looking at social class around the world today and what led to it historically. So in this chapter, the learning objectives then would be, there's a great deal of inequality, and it's often focused between nations, rich nations, poor nations. And so the chapter also wants to bring our focus to the inequalities within nations. And so inequality is not just, of course, between nations. We talk about how rich the United States is, but are the people rich? Who is rich in the United States? So we want to talk about the inequalities within nations, but even on a micro scale within cities and within neighborhoods and down to the granular level. The chapter also introduces sociological theories to help us understand and contextualize the global social problems we're looking at. And so part of this chapter then is to understand the theorists and how their theories can apply to our contemporary social issues. We also, in this chapter, want to understand who the actors are. It's not just governments, but it's also corporations. And how do corporations and governments work together to manage this levels of inequality? With each chapter, you really want to pay attention to the key terms and make sure that you understand and can define those key terms in your own words. So each chapter opens up with a vignette of a particular country that is relevant to the chapter that will follow. And so in this chapter, they talk about the Bahamas in the opening vignette, and they talk about the tourist flying into the Bahamas, the beautiful beaches and the resort hotels that they're off to. And then, of course, the citizens of that nation, the labor that they provide, and the multinational corporations that own the hotels that take that money back to their home countries of, Europe, the United States. So few of those tourist dollars really trickle down to the people. And indeed, the citizens of these tourist areas, especially in the Caribbean, are kept separate from the tourists. And so the tourist economy then is a perfect example of these inequalities, because you have the tourist as an actor, the hotel owner, the government, and the workers themselves. And so as we're thinking about these themes in this chapter, that the tourist economy is really an economy that would be great for students to think about these particular social issues covered in this chapter. So the first big section of this chapter is called The Global Divide, Inequalities Between and Among Nations. And so this chapter starts out with providing us with a macro perspective on global inequalities and how it's measured specifically. So that's the first thing for us to really understand, is how is the wealth of a nation measured, and then how is that compared to other nations around the world to provide these kinds of rankings. And so the first measure points that the chapter points out are the gross domestic product, the GDP, the gross national product, the GNP, and the gross national income, GNI. And so therefore it's important for us to first understand what these measures are and how they're different from each other. And we really want to understand what exactly these tools are measuring, because when they're talked about, it sounds like growth is good for everyone, but indeed we need to understand, is growth good for the corporation, for the government, or for the workers? And so when we talk about these things, we really want to also understand, of course, the perspective of the workers and how they play in to the GDP and how this impacts our daily lives. So the gross domestic product is a measure of the total value of goods and services produced within a country. So anytime money changes hands, every time you buy a coffee, pump your gas, pay your mortgage bill, that is contributing to the gross domestic product. So also to understand this and to understand all of the things that are going into the GDP, we want to understand the things that are not going into the GDP. This resonates with historic feminist movements for wages for housework, for example, in the 1970s. And so they were talking about how women's domestic labor inside the house, doing housework, doing childcare, doing family care for elderly parents, that type of labor is invisible when it's done for free within the family. But if that person were to go across the street and clean their neighbor's house and their neighbor paid them, then that would be registered on the GDP because money would exchange hands. So with the GDP, you want to understand what does go into it, but also what it excludes. The chapter does mention gross domestic product, gross national product, and gross national income, but doesn't go into the explanations and the differences between them. And so gross domestic product is also all of these transactions that happen within our national borders. But think about these transnational corporations. If there's a US corporation that is abroad, then that activity is not being captured in the gross domestic product within our national borders. However, that activity would be captured in the gross national product, which would be relevant to any American corporations and American citizens living anywhere in the world. So anything that is financial transaction that is relevant to our companies, our citizens, where their home base is, regardless of where they're positioned. So an activity that we could do in class to really try to understand, especially the gross domestic product, and I really want us to focus on what is captured by this, but also what is not captured, so that we can understand that there's invisible labor that's happening that's not being captured. So if we think about our daily life and all the ways in which we're spending money, and all the ways in which we are laboring, and the labor that is paid for and the labor that's not paid for, then we can understand all these hidden aspects of what is not captured by this particular economic measuring tool. And then you take the gross domestic product, so this large number of the money that is created within the borders of a nation, and then you divide it by the population to understand how that would be distributed among the people. And so that's where you get these concepts of a high-income country where people are making a high income. However, of course, we know that that's not equally distributed amongst all people and that there's great inequality within a nation. So these kinds of median averages perspectives really don't show you where the people are actually at, which is where you need to dig into the census type of material. And so another large-scale economic measuring tool that the chapter introduces is the Gini index. The Gini index, which is trying to measure income inequality, and it has a scale of 0 to 1, and we can see in the map colors the variations of inequality. And so the chapter points out that the inequality gap among nations is still greater than the gap within a particular country. The chapter states the closing of the worldwide gap is due entirely to gains in Asia and in two countries in particular, China and India, which together account for 1/3 of the global population. So China and India are absolutely central to any understanding of global economic changes. I also included as an example the World Happiness Report because it is also a measure of social inequalities. The World Happiness Report measure is interesting because it is basically measuring social inequalities and equating that with happiness. So here in the United States, we might think of happiness as this like blitzed out state or something. It's actually equated with security. And so we see these Northern European countries that have a lot of social programs that support the people as rated as the happiest in the world. But then when they get interviewed on TV, you know, they look stoic and they are not, you know, blissful or anything, but they're just secure in their life in that country because they have health care, they have securities for housing, they have securities for retirement and stuff like that. So we really want to understand that when they are studying issues of inequalities globally, they're looking at these kinds of social indicators of education, of security, of health and lifespan and stuff like that. So we want to understand all the pieces that are going into these types of measures. The chapter goes into explaining the magnitude of global inequalities. So how a few hundred billionaires, how much they control compared to the citizens of the world. And especially they use the example of the COVID-19 pandemic and how this was a huge transfer of income from the global people, citizens, to these billionaires, especially through their mega corporations that focused on the internet, Amazon, delivery businesses, stuff like that. And so the number of billionaires has increased, the number of the billionaires and millionaires' wealth has increased, but at the same time, the exact same amount of money has been lost from the citizens of this world. The chapter points out that the billionaires overwhelmingly live in the United States, Japan, and Germany, with growing numbers in China and India. So the next section is called Realities of Global Poverty. And in this section, what the key takeaway for us is to understand how the world's population is divided up into these categories of poverty and wealth. So those globally who are considered well off or middle class represent 1.5 billion people in the globe. Those that are living on less than $2 a day represent 10% of the planet. And those that are categorized as in between represent 3.4 billion people. The author does try to demonstrate what this would look like, so particularly focusing on housing facilities, resources, and personal security. And overall, globally, the author points out that the poor still remain in rural areas. And so we have an increasing divide between urban and rural, and poverty is still entrenched in rural places, but urban places have sucked up a lot of wealth globally. And so in any country, you can go to urban places and find the wealth of the nation there, but you can also travel out to the rural areas and see remaining poverty. So these poverty measures and these large-scale economic tools are hard to get our head around. And so an activity that we could do is to understand, first of all, how poverty is measured. And so let's just focus in the United States. How is poverty measured in the United States, and how did that come to be? And so I like to point out to my students that this measure of the poverty line was established in the 60s, I believe, and it went something like this. Like, they examined that poor people spend about a third of their income on food, and so they take this measure of food, however that is defined, and then they multiply it by 3. And so that's where they established the poverty line, and that hasn't really changed since it was established. But think about how our world has changed, right? Especially housing costs, education costs, healthcare costs, like all these costs have exploded compared to when this poverty measure was established. But we're still using this tool today. So the poverty line is set at a certain amount, and that changes annually, the definition of it. And so imagine a family of 4 living on this particular dollar amount, and then anyone just right above that amount is not, of course, captured in this number of those who are defined as living in poverty. I would especially want folks to understand, who does it benefit if the poverty line is lower or higher? And so this is a political question, and what would happen if the poverty line was set at a more realistic level of what it really means to survive in our current society today? The next section in this chapter looks at some theoretical models. This chapter only introduces us to 2 theorists to apply to the topics that we're looking at in this particular chapter, and that's Adam Smith and Karl Marx. As a textbook, of course, it's taking a huge topic and reducing it to a small section in a chapter. So you have to understand that, of course, there's so much material on both of these theorists, but that the chapter is only going to give us a few keywords and takeaways. And so we just really want to memorize these key points. So in 1776, Adam Smith wrote an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And so in a nutshell, they're reducing Smith's theory to this concept of laissez-faire economics, which is let the free hand of the market, let companies do as they're going to do, and if they go bankrupt or become wealthy, so be it, and reduce government interference into these processes. And so this branch of philosophy, as the author states, comes to be known as utilitarians. And so the key words associated with Adam Smith in this section are utilitarianism, laissez-faire economics, and what has more recently come to be termed neoclassic economics or neoliberalism. And so liberalism is the liberalization of the economic market, more freedom to the market, less constraints on the market, not to be confused with Americans' concept of liberals as being a cultural progressive, but liberalism within the marketplace, neoclassical economics, and what we currently refer to in our current practices as neoliberalism. And that's the transition from government programs into privatization of things that were previously provided by the government, and the expansion of private industry into our public life. And the chapter points out that Adam Smith was very aware of the dangers of allowing these corporations to pursue their will, because that would lead to providing workers with the smallest amount as possible, to extract the labor from them before they die, and that corporations could suck up all the wealth in a society and leave nothing for the workers. So there had to be some kind of balance there. The chapter then turns to Karl Marx under a section called The Misery of Nations. And Karl Marx agrees with Adam Smith's perspective of how corporations and the economy will go naturally if left unchecked by not just the government, but of course he was advocating for the workers to come together and to resist these practices. So the author focuses on Karl Marx stating that there are contradictions within the capitalist system that will just cause their own destruction, and that are inherent to this capitalist model and this capitalist endeavor. And that is that there's always going to be a growing divide between those who own the means of production and those who work for them. There's a continual crisis of profits for the owning class, because they're just never satisfied. They always want more and more. They want to compete with their rivals, and they want to exploit more profits. And that drive never ends. So think about how the news is always talking about growth, and that we expect constant growth no matter what, and that the worst thing that could ever be said is that we actually need degrowth to step back in this production that is literally consuming the globe. That's just absolutely unacceptable to the capitalist mentality. It has to have constant growth. The third contradiction they mention are that workers are going to be driven to the levels of subsistence. The owners of the means of production are always going to want to pay the workers the smallest amount possible. And so we can look at the minimum wage in the United States is still $7.25 federally. Look at other countries, look at the minimum wage in Canada, look at the minimum wage in Australia. There's a reason that Americans are really unaware of how the workers in other countries are faring better than they are. We can see today that workers are being forced into further levels of subsistence because a minimum wage job, a full-time job, is just not adequate anymore to pay one's bills in any major city in the United States. The fourth contradiction that the chapter mentions is that there's always the potential and the growing class consciousness and class solidarity among the working class, and that, of course, the hope that they can come together to unify and work to better their position within the system. The next section is called Assessing the Views, and so they take these two views of Adam Smith and Karl Marx and apply them to contemporary global social problems. And so where we see this free market capitalism today is especially in the realm of privatization, of taking social goods and social services that the government once provided and privatizing those, handing them over to private companies so that they can make their profits off of them and the consumer can pay a much higher price to receive those goods. And we can see that with student loan debt. Education used to be more of a public good provided by the state, but now it's become more privatized, so that tuition has skyrocketed and the banks are making a lot of money on the interest of student loans. And of course, these neoliberal economic policies were especially pushed through by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and it's only exponentially increased since then. And then the section talks about particular state examples such as Brazil, that has managed in the 90s and early 2000s to combat poverty and bring up the standards of living of the poorest Brazilians. The section also mentions state socialist systems focusing on Russia and China, and how the transition of these former state socialist countries in the 1990s. This section also talks about the Nordic countries, which the author states are primarily welfare state systems in which the economy is largely capitalist, but the government is actively involved in promoting the welfare of its people. And just that globally, the most common hybrid around the world looks to markets as economic engines of growth and development, and that governments will tax the wealthy and the corporations and redistribute some of that to take care of subsidizing the most impoverished. And that the European model of these governments has produced some of the world's highest standards of living, as well as some of the highest levels of human development. And so overall, this section is just examining the variety of different political orientations of governments and how they either manage more or less the corporations within the nation, and how they do take care of the people through social programs by providing higher levels of social assistance or the lack thereof. The next section in the textbook is called Economic Development, Modernization, and Dependency Theories. And so this section just introduces two theories, Modernization Theory, Dependency Theory. And so we also want to be able to understand just the concept of each of these theories, and then later on apply it to our own example of a particular country. As the author summarizes Modernization Theory and subtitles it Time to Clean House, the author states the underlying premise of modernization theory is that poverty is a basic condition of humanity. People have always been poor. Modernization theory is based upon this dichotomy of traditional culture versus modern culture. Not only does it rely on this binary between traditional culture and modern culture, but of course it assumes that modern culture is better and that traditional culture is what is holding people back from these modernization processes that could raise them out of poverty. Modernization theory, as the author states, is saying that these countries need industry so that they can become more wealthy as a nation. And so they need to change from their traditional way of thinking into these modern concepts. So therefore, traditional values might be fatalism, patience, humility, communal cooperation, respect for the wisdom of elders, and the old order, ties to the land, must be replaced by new modern values, ambition, entrepreneurship, advancement, achievement, and hard-fought competition, and of course individuality, the individual against the community. The next concept states that developing nations need institutions. So you need the institutions that are going to forward these processes. Modern banking, financialization, commodity markets, and so on. And so this is where you see the IMF and World Bank come into countries and really establish these institutions and orient them to this modern economy, which is still a financial extraction economy. Therefore, the author states achieving the ideals of modernization as a representation of, therefore, entering this modern world and being successful pertaining to those measures. Therefore, in contrast to modernization theory, the author moves to the next section, which is dependency theory, which he subtitles Get Out of My House. And for this section, he quotes Lenin and his book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which argues that European imperialism, the wild expansion of the European empires that were to carve up Africa and would eventually help to lead to World War I, was driven by the forces of capitalism. Dependency theory, therefore, is a reaction and the other side of modernization theory. Modernization theory is saying modernization is a good thing, that these backwards traditional countries need to get with the program and modernize. And dependency theory is pointing to the history of imperialism and colonialism and talking about how those factors have shaped the current situation of these countries that are being pressured to modernize. So the author has several different paragraphs of particular points on dependency theory, stating dependency theory brought exploitation. So dependency theory argues that it was colonialism and imperialism that brought the poverty, because these imperialist countries came into these countries, extracted the resources, gave very little to the people and the lands there, and then left them impoverished and took this wealth extracted back to the home country. And therefore that is a system of exploitation. Similarly, the next subheading was dependency brought domination. And so why would these poor countries not resist these kinds of extractions from other countries? And it's because they have come to be at the mercy of these very powerful countries that have engaged in these practices and practices of domination to these poor countries for centuries. The next point the author makes is that the dependency brought distortion. The economies of the poor countries no longer function as an integrated whole. They are entirely structured to serve the needs of wealthy foreigners and maybe a small internal elite. This, of course, resonates with the last chapter's covering of Immanuel Wallerstein's The World Systems Theory. And so again, this chapter mentions the world systems theory as talking about how this history of imperialism and colonialism, these trade practices that were long established, have now evolved into these modernization dependence theories. But these countries, the wealthy countries, the so-called developing countries, are still established in these similar patterns that were established since colonial times. And in this section, they briefly talk about how dependency theory was taken up in places such as Latin America. In Latin America, you did have historically this resistance and people's movements towards the rejection of these colonial powers. And of course, the US involvement in the governmental politics of Latin America, especially in the 1980s. So the main point of this section then is just to understand these two concepts, modernization theory, dependency theory, and to be able to summarize those two opposing perspectives and to then apply that to our own understanding of an example. The next section of this chapter is called When Prehistory Repeats Itself. The author is taking those two previous theoretical models, modernization theory, dependency theory, and now applying it to prehistory. And so this is reminding us of the intro chapter where we talked about human prehistory since the dawn of Homo sapiens and their spread out into the globe. So taking this modernization theory, dependency theory, and applying it in the first paragraph to China. In the modernization theory perspective, it's saying that China was poor because tradition, inward-looking rulers failed to adopt new technologies and ways of doing business. To the second camp, which is the dependency theory, China was held hostage not so much by its own government as by a wolf pack of militaristic nations, those of Europe as well as Japan and the United States, that demanded economic concessions and political acquiescence to the gross exploitation. In the second paragraph, he talks about Latin America. And so in the first camp, he states, which would be the modernization theorists, that Latin America had the misfortune of belonging to the wrong empire. In the second scenario, which would be the dependency theory, Latin America had the misfortune of being ripped off twice, first by Spanish and Portuguese mercantilists, then by British and North American industrialists. The next paragraph says, why is Africa so poor? One scenario points to drought conditions, soil that lacks nutrients, abundance of disease coupled with traditional village-based societies. The second view points to the recent orgy of industrial imperialists that divided the continent and only began to relinquish its hold in the last few decades. And then the next part of this section goes on to say, have people always been poor? So thinking about hunter-gatherers, our earliest ancestors, roaming in the open natural world, are they impoverished? So how can you even apply these concepts of poverty and modernization to these ancient kind of prehistoric human developments? So therefore the chapter skips ahead in this next page to the concept of civilization. And civilization would be equated with the development of cities, institutions, these kinds of social structures that really become embedded. And he highlights another key term, what anthropologists call the Neolithic Revolution, which would be the transition to farming. Hunter-gatherers living subsistence lives off the land, is that considered poverty? Well, we don't even have the conceptualization of that. That's just life on Earth until we have civilization, which is based on this Neolithic Revolution, which is the transition to farming. So rather than being a nomadic lifestyle that's following the food sources, that's following the weather trends, the Neolithic Revolution of transition to farming is based on large-scale grain agriculture providing a food surplus that could be stored and shipped. And so now humans can stockpile food and therefore start to stockpile all kinds of resources, establish cities and institutions basically, and civilizations, cultures, and so on. And with these rises of the stockpiling of resources comes with it the rise of inequalities, of then you have kings and rulers who can really stockpile these resources and exploit the labor of the people and the workers. And so this section then comes up to more contemporary times that have thus transitioned into the concept of what the author quotes anthropologist Oscar Lewis coins the term culture of poverty, which is examining poor communities in capitalist societies and basically blaming the poor people for being poor, saying that they have this culture of poverty, that they just live day to day, that it is their own poverty mentality that keeps them in this trap of engaging in poverty-producing behaviors. The final section of the chapter is called Ending Extreme Poverty, Markets and Beyond. The chapter is contending that the global economy is now dominated by this capitalist, imperialist, corporate mindset. While there have been some socialist states, that the overwhelming global economy is dominated by global corporate capitalism and has been for centuries. And so the challenge then is to not attempt to balance out these corporate interests along with human rights interests, worker rights interests, and those interests of the planet. And so overall, this section is concluding by debating the theories and the outcomes of focusing on corporate interests and focusing on the social human outcomes, with the focus of trying to attempt to create organizations and policies that can temper these most extreme outcomes of the global corporate marketplace and to protect people and human rights. So the author does point to institutions such as the United Nations and some of their aims to achieve these ends. So overall then, and recently, humans have been uplifted out of the most extreme poverty, and especially due to shifts in Asia, and the author particularly mentioned China and India, that such global inequalities continue to persist between nations and within any particular country. Overall, hopefully you can understand now some of these key terms that were used in this chapter and apply it to what we see in the news about contemporary global social problems. And these kinds of theoretical backgrounds are going to help us now transition to the next chapter, which is focusing on the global assembly line. I appreciate your attention, and please do let me know how some of these ideas in this chapter can be relevant for a particular example that you're familiar with. So see you in the next chapter.